We all love animals, but love alone is not enough to buy a new tractor. That's why today I will discuss a question that concerns both you and me. Which animal is the most profitable to farm and which ones are worth raising only out of passion? To investigate this, I conducted a 2-year experiment buying 10 adult animals of each type. I wanted to see how much they would eat during this period and how much profit we could potentially make from them. To calculate profitability, I figured out how much I would earn by selling the food they consumed at the highest possible price. Then, I divided the cost by the maximum potential earnings to determine the possible profit. If this is unclear, I'll explain it in a moment, but first let's look at the ranking after a year of this experiment. Chickens took second place in Tier A with a score of 3.74. This means that if instead of selling the grain directly to the market, we feed it to the chickens and sell the eggs, we would earn 3.74 times more. So for example, instead of $100, we would earn $374. I also considered newborn animals and manure in the case of pigs and cows. During this experiment, I performed many calculations, which I won't detail here to avoid boring you. However, if anyone is very interested, they can ask on Discord. I will expand on the topic there, link in the description. Now back to the tier list. In Tier F, the weakest performers after a year were pigs, followed by beef cows, then dairy cows, and surprisingly, horses made it to the podium. The first place went to sheep with an astronomical score of 21. No wonder, since grass is cheap to buy. However, as I mentioned, this is the result after 1 year, but I conducted a 2-year experiment. So let's see how our tier list looks after 2 years. The only change is that cows dropped to the very bottom of the table, while sheep achieved an even more astonishing result. You might think this is a gold mine, but that's just in theory. Before you start a massive breeding operation, let's take a closer look at this experiment and animal farming in practice. Let's start with pigs, which were once considered a real gold mine, especially in Farming Simulator 17. Let's see what went wrong this time and whether they should be rated much higher in practice. Personally, I wouldn't place them on the podium because even though we don't need a special feed mixer to feed them, ensuring 100% efficiency requires either investing in feed, which may not be profitable in the long run, as even the game's developers suggest, or having a huge amount of machinery and storage facilities for all the necessary crops. From an economic standpoint, their score increased significantly over the year of the experiment because with pigs, profitability comes from having as many as possible and ensuring they breed quickly. As I mentioned, I started with only 10, so that's why their score increased, and in subsequent years they would be even more profitable. However, if aiming to rapidly expand our farm, I wouldn't choose pigs due to their profitability and the significant time investment required in cultivating all the necessary crops for them. Nevertheless, in comparison to others, they deserve a Tier B rating for the practical aspects of breeding. Therefore, why don't horses deserve a Tier B? Primarily because they require regular riding. As I mentioned earlier, I bought 10 animals, which means 10 horses that need to be ridden every day. It turns out that to achieve 100% daily activity, I need 1 minute and 40 seconds of continuous forward riding. Including the time to return the horses to the stable, we can round this up to 2 minutes per horse, totaling 20 minutes of aimless riding daily for 10 horses. Initially, it's fun when you're exploring a newly downloaded map, but it becomes tiresome later on. As part of this experiment, I installed a mod that performed this task for me, because doing it manually would have taken forever. In summary, considering the practical aspect and my feelings after the 2-year experiment, I would place horses at the bottom tier purely as a hobby for occasional rides around the map rather than a serious, profitable business venture. So cows practically can't be at the bottom tier. They are divided into 2 main categories, beef and dairy. I checked all 4 types because I read they differ, not just in appearance. However, I'll let you in on a secret. It turns out beef cows differ from dairy cows and the others are just a matter of appearance. Essentially, we have 2 types of cows, not 4. Regarding beef cows, it's interesting that despite needing more feed, we actually earn less from selling them compared to dairy cows and their milk. However, the price of beef is stable, whereas I considered the maximum milk price. If I had taken the average milk price into account, the comparison might look a bit different. In terms of practicality, both types of cows require a lot of work. Choosing automated barns reduces this somewhat, but it's still significant. The plus side is that starting with 10 cows, I only needed to top up their feed after about a year and a half. In contrast with horses, I had to do this several times, not to mention the daily rides as I mentioned earlier. Let's focus on dairy cows because they particularly interested me. They're often chosen by players and have been in the game for a decade. That's why I decided decided to conduct an additional experiment, but I'll get to that in a moment. For the practical tier list, both beef and dairy cows would occupy tier E. Both types require practically the same amount of work. The only difference is that with dairy cows we're hauling milk, whereas with beef cows it's the cattle themselves. Let's move on to the most interesting part, the clear winners of this competition. To be 100% sure, I decided to conduct an additional experiment, specifically a one-day test with a full barn of adult animals. As I mentioned earlier, this also includes cows, so let's start with them and close the topic of cows first. Their score in this test was 1.91. I double-checked this, and the lower score is likely due to the fact that in such a one-day test, no new animals are born and there's no room for them in the barn. So let's move on to the cherry on our cake, or rather, the cherries. Regarding chickens, the score is 5.19, which is higher for a very interesting reason that I observed. To ensure its accuracy, I conducted this one-day test several times. I noticed that depending on the age of the chickens, they lay different amounts of eggs. This makes sense, but regardless of their age, they consume the same amount of feed. The conclusion is that it's not worth selling chickens because it's not very profitable, as we can't transport them ourselves, and direct sale from the coop is minimally profitable. Additionally, younger chickens lay fewer eggs but eat as much as older ones, which is less logical. But I can only summarize it with the words, "Welcome to Farming Simulator." Let's move on to our current winner, whose score in the one-day test is 20. This result is similar to the first year, but it differs significantly from the result of the previous 2-year experiment. The reason is similar to that of the cows. I started with one large barn containing 10 animals. To avoid losing any potential animals, I added another large barn to which I moved some animals to expand our farm, which is the essence of this game. I conducted this test multiple times, especially because of the chickens. As sheep age, they consume more feed and produce more wool, which is logical. However, chickens, regardless of age, consume the same amount of feed even though younger chickens lay fewer eggs. To summarize this challenge and determine the ultimate winner, we need to consider the practical aspect. In the case of chickens, gathering and storing grain is somewhat simpler. Although hay can also be easily stored in a hayloft, obtaining it requires much more work than harvesting grain for chickens. Nonetheless, we harvest more than 4 times the amount of hay or grass on the same area compared to any grain used to feed chickens. How do I know this? Because I checked, but more on that in the next episode of this series. For now, sheep definitely dominate in both economic and practical aspects. However, these are just test conditions, and I'll explore how this translates into the game in a dedicated video. See you soon!